There are moments in life you can't take back, and if you miss them, you'll spend the rest of your days wondering what might have happened if you'd stepped forward instead of looking away. That morning in Dry Willow, the moment belonged to Hannah Mercer. She stood at the edge of the market square, her black dress sun-bleached from years of wear, her face carved by 50 winters on the frontier. Before her 10 children sat huddled under a faded canvas awning, barefoot, silent, eyes dull from hunger, too tired even to cry. The auctioneer barked the lot number as if calling out cattle. The crowd didn't gasp, didn't protest, they simply shifted their weight as though this was just another part of the day. Most people in that square would tell you they didn't have the means to take on a single child, let alone 10, and they would have gone home with their consciences intact, convincing themselves they'd done nothing wrong. But Hannah didn't move away. She reached into her leather purse and said 5 words that made the entire square fall silent. "I'll take them, all 10. That was when the whispers began. "She's lost her mind since the fever took her boy. Those children will starve faster on her land than here." Even Marshal Gray Carter stepped forward, his badge catching the sunlight. "Hannah, your ranch can't feed you much less." "That's my business," she cut in. She began counting coins into the auctioneer's palm, silver clinking in the morning air, each drop sounding heavier than the last. And that's when the youngest boy, freckles across his cheeks and no shoes on his feet, looked up at her and asked in a voice so small it nearly disappeared into the wind, "Ma'am, are you going to hurt us?" Hannah knelt down so they were eye to eye. "What's your name, Tom?" "Well, Tom, not while I'm breathing." No one in that square knew what she meant by that. They didn't know that the sentence she'd just spoken would ripple through the next year of her life, through nights of suspicion, through the shadow of a man who tried to take everything from her, before through the slow, steady thaw of a heart she thought was gone forever. They didn't know that those 10 children weren't the burden she was taking on. They were the reason she would finally lay her burden down. What they did know, and what they would talk about for weeks afterward, was the sight of a lonely widow driving a wagon full of silent, starving orphans out of town. What they didn't know was what waited for them on the road ahead. Do you keep watching to find out what that one sentence set in motion? The morning air in Dry Willow was brittle as old glass, carrying the scent of dust horse sweat and the faint copper tang of the blacksmith's forge. In the middle of the market square beneath a faded canvas awning, 10 children sat on a rough plank bench. Their clothes hung in tatters, their knees drawn up tight, eyes hollow from too many nights without a warm meal. The crowd didn't speak loudly, but their whispers rustled like dry leaves. "No one's gonna take all of them. More mouths than they're worth." Hannah Mercer stood at the edge of the gathering, her black dress sun-bleached at the shoulders, a small leather purse hanging from her gloved hand. At 50, she moved with the careful, deliberate steps of someone who had learned to guard every motion. Life had pressed her into a shape she had never chosen, married off at 19, to a man twice her age, widowed before 40 left, to tend a barren stretch of land no one else wanted. The auctioneer, a thin man with a sunburned neck and the grin of someone who'd stopped caring long ago, slapped the post beside the children. "Lot 12. 10 in one go. Strong enough to work, young enough to train." Hannah stepped forward. "I'll take them." The auctioneer squinted at her as if she were a trick of the light. "All 10. All 10. From the back, a woman's voice carried across the square. "She's lost her mind since the fever took her boy." Hannah heard it but didn't turn. She had learned long ago that looking at cruelty gave it more power. The town's Marshal Gray Carter pushed through the onlookers, his badge catching the early light. "Hannah, your land can barely feed you. What in God's name are you doing?" That she said, her voice steady as a drawn bowstring, "is my business." She lifted the purse, the coins inside shifting with a weight that felt heavier than silver. With each one she placed in the auctioneer's palm, the air in the square seemed to tighten. When the last coin dropped, the youngest boy, barefoot, freckled, and no older than 6, looked up at her. "Ma'am, are you going to hurt us?" Hannah knelt so they were eye to eye. "What's your name, Tom?" "Well, Tom," she said, and for the first time that morning, her voice softened, "not while I'm breathing." The crowd still didn't understand. They only saw a solitary widow buying 10 more burdens to carry home. But in Hannah's heart, a door she thought had been nailed shut for good creaked open, the same door that led back to a winter long ago, to a loss that had never stopped echoing. What could drive a woman who had already lost everything to take on 10 more lives? The road from Dry Willow to the Mercer Ranch stretched out like a ribbon of dust, winding between brittle sagebrush and low hills that wore the last snow of winter. The wagon wheels groaned over the ruts, each creak a reminder of the weight it carried. The 10 children sat close together in the wagon bed, their small bodies swaying with the motion. Some stared at the sky, others at the ground, but none looked at Hannah. She kept her gaze fixed on the trail ahead, reins firm in her hands, her back as straight as the fence posts lining the road. Halfway home, the sound of hooves rose behind them. A moment later, Marshal Gray Carter pulled alongside on his chestnut mare. His hat was low against the sun, but his eyes were sharp. "Hannah," he called over the rhythm of the horses. "This isn't a joke. 10 children. What's your plan?" She didn't look at him. "To let them live. That's all. That's enough." The answer seemed to hang in the dry air between them. Gray studied her profile, the hard lines worn by years, the mouth that seemed to have forgotten how to smile, and he said nothing more. With a slow shake of his head, he dropped back and followed at a distance. When the wagon finally crested the rise, the Mercer Ranch came into view. The house stood weathered and tired, its paint faded to the color of old bone. Fences leaned under the wind, and the barn roof sagged in the middle. It looked like the kind of place where dreams came to die. But Hannah did not take the children into the main house. Instead, she steered them around the side toward a newer building, its cedar boards still warm in color, the scent of cut wood lingering in the air. She swung the door wide. Inside was a long row of narrow beds, each topped with a folded wool blanket. A large wooden table sat in the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs. Light streamed in through clean windows, catching on shelves stocked with tin cups and simple plates. The oldest girl, hair the color of pale wheat and braided tight, stepped inside and blinked in disbelief. "This looks like a home." "It's a place to sleep," Hannah said, her tone flat. "Tomorrow work begins." A murmur went through the group, a mix of fear and hope. That night, when the children had settled, or at least gone still, Hannah stepped out onto the porch of the main house. The moon hung low, spilling silver light over the fields. Somewhere beyond the far ridge lay a small weathered cross, her boy's grave. She kept her eyes on it the way a ship might keep its eyes on the shore it left behind. Bootsteps sounded on the porch boards. Marshal Gray stood there, hat in hand. "You're taking on more than you can carry," he said quietly. "I've carried worse." He hesitated, then asked the question that had been on his tongue since the market. "Hannah, are you trying to save them or yourself?" She didn't answer, but the way her fingers tightened around the porch rail said more than words. Gray's question struck like a match in a dark room, lighting corners of her heart she'd sworn never to see again. Morning on the Mercer Ranch came with the creak of floorboards and the smell of wood smoke. Hannah woke the children before the sun had fully breached the horizon. Up, wash, breakfast in 10. They moved hesitantly, still unsure of the rules in this strange new place. At the long table in the cedar house, steaming bowls of oatmeal waited. A few of the younger ones looked at the food as if it might vanish if they blinked. After they ate, Hannah led them outside. The air was sharp with early spring cold, the ground still holding the memory of frost. She pointed toward the small vegetable plot, the chicken coop, and the long shed at the edge of the yard. "You'll learn to plant, gather eggs, mend and bake. Everyone works. Everyone earns their place here." Her tone was firm, but her eyes lingered on each face as if memorizing them. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, sunrise to sunset, small hands, learning the weight of tools, the feel of soil, the patience of threading a needle. Outwardly, Hannah was all discipline, a wall of rules and expectation. But in quiet moments, she revealed something else. She bent to fix the hem of a boy's too long trousers without a word. She wrapped a shawl over the shoulders of the youngest girl when the wind picked up. Once, when she thought no one was looking, she hummed a tune so soft it almost disappeared into the sound of the chickens. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the road. His coat was dusted from travel, his boots polished despite the dirt. Jacob Thorne. The name alone made the air feel colder. He reined in at the gate, his smile a thin line that didn't reach his eyes. "Hannah Mercer," he called. "Word is you've got yourself a handful of new workers." "They're children, not workers," she replied, her voice low but steady. Jacob dismounted, leaning on the fence. "Everything's got a price, even their little hands. I could take them off your burden. They're not yours to take. He studied her for a long moment, the corner of his mouth curling. You've still got that fire. I like that, but fire burns out, Hannah. Remember that. He mounted up and rode off, leaving a ribbon of dust curling in his wake. That night, the children sensed something had shifted. The older girl with wheat-colored hair, her name was Clara, lingered at the doorway of the main house. Ma'am, Clara asked softly, is that man gonna come back? Yes. Are you scared of him? No. Hannah paused, looking out into the dark where the road disappeared. But I don't trust him not to hurt what's mine. In the weeks that followed, Marshall Gray began stopping by more often. He said it was to check on the children, but he never came empty-handed, a sack of flour, a jar of preserves, a few worn but sturdy boots. He talked to the children about planting in good soil, about how to mend fences, about the importance of keeping one another safe. And sometimes his eyes would rest on Hannah a fraction longer than necessary, as if he saw through the armor she wore, and was quietly taking note of every crack. Between the shadow of Jacob Thorne and the steady presence of Marshall Gray, Hannah began to feel the ground shifting beneath her feet, torn between the past that still hunted her and the faint glimmer of something that might be worth trusting. Between the shadow of Jacob Thorne and the steady presence of Marshall Gray, Hannah began to feel the ground shifting beneath her feet, torn between the past that still hunted her and the faint glimmer of something that might be worth trusting. The wind carried the smell of rain that afternoon, pressing low clouds against the hills. Hannah was mending a fence line with Clara when the sound of multiple horses reached them. It was a sound she knew, too many hooves moving too quickly to be casual. 3 riders appeared at the bend in the road. Jacob Thorne was at the front, flanked by 2 men in dark coats. The dust around them swirled like smoke from a brush fire. Jacob reined in at the gate, his smile slow and deliberate. I've come to settle a matter, Hannah. You have something that belongs to me. They belong to no one, she said, straightening her back. He dismounted, boots crunching over the dry earth. I've got papers signed and witnessed. Those children were sold for labor, and you can't just keep them here playing house. Hannah's jaw tightened. You forged those papers, Jacob. One of his men chuckled under his breath. Easy accusation for a woman with no proof. That was when the sound of another horse came from the east. Marshall Gray rode into view, his badge catching a rare shaft of sunlight through the clouds. Jacob Gray said evenly, put those papers away. You and I both know the law says no child works under contract without territorial review. Jacob sneered. And we both know I've friends who sign off without asking questions. Gray dismounted, stepping between Hannah and the men. Not this time. Hannah moved past them both, disappearing into the main house. When she returned, she carried a small wooden chest. She set it down on the porch rail, lifted the lid, and began pulling out bundles of documents, each one wrapped in oilcloth edges, worn from handling. These, she said, her voice cutting clean through the thick air, are adoption papers. Every one of those children is under my care by legal agreement with the county clerk. And here she held up a leather-bound ledger as the record of every cent earned from their work here. Each child has an account in the Dry Willow Bank waiting for them when they're grown. For a moment, the only sound was the shifting of the horses. They're not here to make me rich, Hannah continued. They're here to learn how to live without fear of men like you. Jacob stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she and Gray could hear. You think a few papers will stop me? I know what happened to your husband. I know how to make folks believe it was your doing. Hannah didn't flinch. Do what you want, Jacob. But this time, you won't be the only one telling the story. The threat hung between them like the coming storm, and Hannah knew that if Jacob couldn't take the children, he would try to take her name. By sundown, the rumors had already reached every corner of Dry Willow. Jacob Thorne's voice carried fast, claiming that Hannah Mercer had killed her husband years ago to take the land, that the so-called adoption papers were just another cover for her schemes. The next morning, Hannah stepped into town for supplies and felt the shift instantly. Conversation stopped when she passed. A shopkeeper's smile faltered. A mother pulled her child a little closer. By the time she returned to the ranch, Marshall Gray Carter was waiting in the yard. His hat was in his hand, but his eyes were steady. He's pushing hard, Hannah. Folks are starting to wonder if there's truth in it. There's truth, she said quietly, just not the kind he's telling. Gray hesitated, then asked, Do you want me to dig? I want you to know what you're walking into. If you do, she replied, it's not a clean story. That evening, Gray rode out beyond the ridge, visiting a few old ranch hands who had worked the Mercer land in years past. Piece by piece, the truth came together, not whispered scandal, but hard fact. Hannah's late husband had been a violent man, known for drinking himself blind and turning his rage on her. The night he died, he'd stumbled home in a storm, shouting about debts. He'd fallen into the well behind the barn, too drunk to climb out. No one had spoken up for her then, not against Jacob, who had moved fast to help her settle the estate, and in the process strip away half her land. 2 days later, Gray called a meeting in the town's hall. The benches filled with townsfolk, the air heavy with curiosity and suspicion. Hannah stood at the front, hands clasped in front of her, Gray beside her. Jacob's been lying to you, Gray began, his voice carrying to the back of the room. The night Thomas Mercer died, it was an accident, and I have witness statements to prove it. Witnesses who were too afraid to speak back then. Jacob, lounging against the wall, let out a sharp laugh. Convenient story, but we all know a woman like her. That's enough, Gray, cutting, his voice sharp as a whip crack. This woman has taken in 10 children no one else would claim. She's feeding them, teaching them, giving them the tools to survive. And she's doing it while men like you try to grind her name into the dirt. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some heads turned toward Jacob, now not Hannah. Hannah looked at the faces in front of her, some skeptical, some softening, and for the first time in years, she let her voice break. I couldn't save my own boy from the fever, she said, but I'll be damned if I let another man take away children who still have a chance. For a long moment, no one moved. Then old Mrs. Calloway, who had lived in Dry Willow longer than anyone, stood and said, I believe her. Others followed. A few still looked doubtful, but the tide had shifted. When the meeting broke, Gray stayed behind with her in the empty hall. You could have left this all in the dark, he said. Why bring it into the open? Because shadows grow in silence, she replied, and I'm tired of living in them. For the first time, Hannah felt the weight on her chest ease, but she knew Jacob Thorne was not a man to surrender without a fight. Spring came late to the high country that year, as if it too had been holding its breath. The snowmelt trickled down from the hills into the irrigation ditch, filling the rows in Hannah Mercer's garden. The earth smelled rich and alive again. The children had settled into the rhythm of the ranch, planting seedlings in straight lines, mending chicken pens, taking turns in the kitchen. Laughter began to spill into the air, where once there had only been silence. One Saturday afternoon, Marshal Gray Carter arrived with a bundle under his arm. He handed it to Hannah without ceremony. Inside was a worn guitar, its varnish dulled, but the strings clean and new. It was my father's, Gray said. Haven't touched it in years. Figured you might know what to do with it. Hannah ran her fingers over the smooth wood. It's been a long time since I played anything. Long time since you let yourself, he said softly. That evening after supper, the children gathered on the porch steps. The sun slid down behind the hills, painting the sky in bruised purples and gold. Hannah sat in the rocker, the guitar resting against her knee. She began to play, halting at first, then, with growing confidence, an old hymn her mother used to hum while hanging laundry. The notes floated out into the cooling air, and the children swayed to the rhythm. When the song ended, the youngest girl, May, climbed into her lap. Will you play again tomorrow? Hannah looked down at her, a smile breaking through like sunlight through clouds. Yes, May, tomorrow and the day after. Gray stayed behind after the children drifted off to bed. They stood on the porch listening to the night crickets. You know, he said, leaning against the railing, most folks wouldn't do what you've done here. Not just taking them in, keeping your heart open after everything. She shook her head. It's not open. Not all the way. He glanced at her, his voice dropping. Then maybe someone should remind you how to open it again. For the first time in years, Hannah didn't look away when someone spoke to her like that. She felt something stir, not the old ache of loss, but the small, cautious beat of a heart that might be ready to trust again. A year to the day since the market in Dry Willow, the Cedar house smelled of fresh bread and lilac soap. The children had been whispering and darting about all morning, hiding something from Hannah Mercer. After supper, Clara stood and cleared her throat. Ma'am, we've got something for you. From the back room, the children emerged carrying a large folded quilt. They spread it out over Hannah's lap. Each square was made from scraps of fabric, old work shirts, bits of dress, hems flour, sackcloth stitched together with uneven but determined hands. In the center, embroidered in careful letters, were the words, "Home is where someone stays." Hannah swallowed hard, tracing the stitches with her fingertips. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Every single piece." "It's us," Tom said proudly. "All of us together." She stood and the children gathered around as she carried the quilt into the main house. She hung it on the wall above the hearth where it caught the glow of the firelight. Later that evening, when the little ones were asleep and the house was quiet, Marshall Gray Carter arrived. He stepped inside holding a small wooden box. "This was my mother's," he said, placing it on the table. Inside, nestled on a piece of velvet, lay a simple silver ring, worn smooth by time. "I don't know if you'd ever want to wear a ring again," Gray continued, his voice low, "but I know I'd like to spend the rest of my days beside a woman who's brave enough to turn a place of sorrow into a place of hope." Hannah looked at him for a long moment, her hand resting on the quilt, as if drawing strength from every stitch. "I can't promise I'll stop being stubborn," she said finally. "That's fine." Gray smiled. "I like stubborn." She didn't give an answer, in words only reached out her hand and let him place the ring there. It wasn't a vow sealed in church bells and white lace. It was something quieter, steadier, like a campfire that burned through the night, keeping the cold at bay. The next morning, the children woke to the sight of Hannah and Gray on the porch, side by side, sipping coffee as the sun rose over the hills. And in that golden light, the ranch didn't look weathered anymore. It looked lived in. Sometimes love comes late, but when it arrives, it stays. And sometimes the most enduring homes are not built of wood and nails, but of people who choose day after day not to walk away. Some stories end with a wedding, a deed signed, or a villain in chains. But for Hannah Mercer, the truest ending was quieter. The sound of children's laughter where there had once been only wind, the steady presence of Marshall Gray Carter beside her on the porch, and the knowledge that the home she had built was not just walls and timber, but trust. She hadn't set out to change 10 lives. She had only wanted to keep a promise she made long ago, that as long as she had breath, no one in her care would be hurt again. And in keeping it, she discovered something most of us forget when we fight for someone else's tomorrow. We often heal our own yesterdays. Life has a way of giving us chances to step forward, sometimes in the middle of a dusty market square, sometimes in our own quiet kitchen. We don't always get to see the ending when we begin, but courage, even the small kind, can carry us further than we think. If this story touched you, I hope it reminds you that you too can be someone who stands between the vulnerable and the storm. This is None, Wild West Saga, where we bring you stories of courage, kindness, and the kind of love that lasts. If you enjoyed Hannah's journey, please subscribe, share this story, and leave a comment. Tell us, would you like to see what happens next for Hannah Gray and the children, or hear more tales of unlikely love and second chances?